frequent contributor to the New Yorker and the New York Review of Books, where he is editor-at-large. His books include the memoirs An Odyssey and The Lost, as well as 3 collections of essays and criticism, most recently Ecstasy and Terror. He teaches literature at Bard College. Three Rings, which he'll be discussing with Benjamin Moser tonight, explores the themes of exile and wandering, homecoming, and fated closures in literature, but also in real life and history by invoking Homer's Odyssey and Homeric ring composition to tell the stories of 3 exiled writers' lives. Daniel's joined tonight by Benjamin Moser, author most recently of Pulitzer Prize-winning book Sontag, Her Life and Work, which is out in paperback next week. Welcome, Daniel and Ben. The floor is all yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Beth. Hi, Daniel. It's fun to see you. I wonder if we'll ever meet again live, but
I know.
It's still fun to see you.
I know. Great to see you. Should we tell everybody about our very long history?
Yeah, well, I was thinking about it. You are probably the first person I ever met who was a writer, sort of that I met in an official adult capacity, although I was 21, I think, when I met you.
Right.
I got a job right out of college at Alfred A. Knopf, which was publishing The Elusive Embrace. Now, was that your second book? Hadn't you published an academic?
No, that was my first book. That was my first book and your first job. And Ben.
And you were the only author I knew, because I thought, I mean, basically.
And you stayed in the business. You stayed in the business. I take that as a compliment. You know?
Well, I left that part of the business. And I remember sort of being intimidated because I didn't really know authors except as people that you might see on a thing like this, you know, like in a bookstore or something. And you came in the office and you were this cute gay guy. And I was like, oh, it's just a gay guy. Like, I can deal with that.
Very long time ago, yeah.
And it was 22 years ago, 23 years ago. That's how long we've known each other, which puts you in the category of the people that I've known the longest in the world, which is a little bit weird.
Well, it just occurred to me when I was reading the description of our event, and it was like, Daniel is appearing with Pulitzer Prize winning, blah, blah, blah. And I thought, it just suddenly hit me that you were this really a kind of baby. It was your first job. It was my first book. It was the late 90s. So
yeah, it was 1998. Oh, so it's even more than, and I remember I thought you were so cool. And I also thought it was cool that you sort of wanted to talk to me, because I felt like this low on the totem pole person, which indeed I was. And we went to the St. Regis and we had Negronis, which was like the coolest, most adult thing I'd ever done. To this day,
well,
I of course had no idea.
That's all I have to say, you know.
Are you drinking alcohol during this event?
I am. I'm drinking a Negroni on the rocks.
Oh my God. See, listen, it was all my
memory. And how perfect is that? Because my book is all about circularity. So there you go.
Yeah.
There you go.
We had all these things in common. Like, we had a Jewish refugee background, which was really interesting and something that is hard for people who don't have that background to really understand as much. And we'll talk about that in a minute.
Yeah.
We were interested in languages and literature, and we were interested also in being gay, if I can put it that way. And those things sort of, they weren't really obvious connections unless they were obvious. And they were obvious to you and obvious to me. And it was so fun talking to you. And when Elusive Embrace came out, you had Greek poetry next to like picking up guys on 9th Avenue. And I just thought that was the coolest thing ever, you know? And because it seemed obvious to me. And then when you wrote The Lost, you went to Ukraine, where your family had lived. Mm-hmm. And you went with a guy called Alex Dunai. And then when I went to research my first book, also about a Ukrainian Jewish refugee story, Alex drove me around Podolia too, and we talked about you, and we felt like your spirit was there. But one thing I think that for me that you've always symbolized and it's sort of similar to what Susan Sontag symbolized for a lot of people, was the connection between an academically trained writer and the educated public. And this was something that I felt the lack of so keenly when I was, you know, in school.
Right.
Is that academia was always, you know, speaking of like three rings, it was like one ring and it was all talking to itself. And
Right.
it wasn't really doing that kind of thing where
Right.
people who were interested in stuff, but they weren't necessarily specialists in ancient Greek, but they were interested in the world and in politics and in literature and in culture.
Right.
You represented that to me. And so I think this book reflects all of those things. And I mean, maybe do you want to start out just reading a little bit as an introduction?
Yeah, I do. You know, in the new disposition, we're told that unlike in-store events, one is supposed to avoid being a talking head as much as possible. But, you know, as you mentioned, this is my shortest book, but it sort of brings together, funnily enough, in the way you were just describing, Ben, this way that I like to do of weaving together different strands of my interests. And this book, although it's the shortest, I think it combines everything that I've been up to for the past 30 years, basically, as a writer. And you know, it's about a kind of storytelling that weaves things together and creates these sort of spiraling narratives, and it sort of enacts that as well. So it brings together my interest in the Holocaust and the shadow that has cast over subsequent history, which also raises the questions of sort of civilizations in decline and how you rescue things from dying civilizations. It brings together my interest, obviously, in classical literature, because the Odyssey and its way of storytelling is central to this new book. And so I just thought I'd read a little from the very beginning, and it also is about writing more than any other book that I've ever, or any other anything actually, that I've written, because it actually invokes the Holocaust, my book about the Holocaust, Homer, my book about Homer, at a moment when I was sort of stuck. And I got restarted because of a insight that I had into a certain kind of storytelling. So I'm just going to read from the first couple of pages for, you know, 4 or 5 minutes max, just to give people who are registered some sense of what the book actually feels like. So I'm just going to read from the very beginning. And this is how it starts. For a period of several years in the new century, I was working on a book, the research for which required me to travel extensively through the United States, Eastern Europe, Scandinavia, Israel, and Australia. I went to those places in order to interview a number of survivors of and witnesses to certain events that took place during the Second World War in a small Eastern Polish town where some relatives of mine had lived. These relatives were ordinary people of little interest to history, but nonetheless the focus, the center, so to speak, of the story I wanted to tell about who they had been and how they had died. Just as the town itself, a place of little historical importance, had yet been the focus of my relatives' lives, the fixed point from which they had never really wanted to stray. And so they died there, some hidden quite close to the house where they had lived, only to be betrayed, some rounded up and shot in the town square or in the old cemetery nearby, some transported to remote locales and then gassed. From this small place, the few survivors would later radiate outward after the war was over to distant parts of the world, places that only 15 years earlier would have struck those townspeople as improbable, absurd even, as destinations, let alone as places to live. Copenhagen, Tashkent, Stockholm, Brooklyn, Minsk, Beersheba, Bondi Beach. Those were the places I had to go 60 years later in order to talk to the survivors and hear the tales they had to tell about my relatives. The only way to get to the center of my story, then, was by means of elaborate detours to distant peripheries. When I was finished writing the story, I found myself unable to move. At the time, I told myself that I was merely tired, but now the distance of a decade and a half permits me to see that I had experienced a crisis of some kind, even a kind of breakdown. For some months, I found it hard to leave my apartment, let alone do any traveling. I had been to Australia and Denmark and Ukraine, Israel and Poland and Sweden, been to the mass graves and the museums, including a museum in Tel Aviv where, to my surprise, the thing that moved me most was a room full of meticulous models of synagogues that had over the millennia been built through the territory of the Jewish diaspora. In Kaifeng, China, and in Cochin, India, the 6th century Beit Alpha synagogue in Lower Galilee, and the 12th century Santa Maria la Blanca synagogue in Toledo, the 19th century Tempio Israelitico in Florence, and its contemporary, the Oranienburger Straße synagogue in Berlin, all of them now painstakingly recreated in miniature in Israel, a country that did not exist when those buildings were gutted. I was so moved, I think, because at one point from late childhood to early adolescence, I myself had been an obsessive model builder, carefully constructing precise scale replicas of ancient buildings, the mortuary temple of the Egyptian pharaoh Hatshepsut, the Parthenon in Athens, the Circus Maximus in Rome. And so as I stood there in the model room of the museum in Tel Aviv, halfway through the worldwide journey I undertook in the early 2000s, I had a strong emotional connection. I was familiar, after all, with the impulse to make replicas, which is haunted by a poignant paradox, the belief in our ability to recreate and the acknowledgement that the original has been lost. The trip to the model room was the only occasion when I cried during my travels. Later, during the period of immobility that followed my return home, I'd sometimes find myself in the middle of a room looking around, unable to remember why I had entered it. Standing perplexed in this way, motionless, I would burst into tears. A psychiatrist friend of mine suggested at the time that I was experiencing a kind of post-traumatic event. Having listened to tales of violence and destruction for 5 years running, without being able to assimilate them emotionally, because at the time I was listening to them, my only thought was to get the story, I was now, my friend surmised, having a delayed reaction. It was here, back in the familiar space of my home, that, she said, I was doing my grieving. Whatever the reason, I felt emptied, emotionally and creatively. Every time I tried to begin a new project, it was as if I had become one of the elderly witnesses or survivors I had written about, a vacant wanderer, arrived at last at a blank new place, unable to go on. This strange state persisted for some time after I returned from my final research trip, which I took in July 2005, and which brought me at one point to Eastern Poland, where I saw the newly opened memorial of the Belzec death camp. A striking monument which, you might say, is all periphery and no center. The memorial consists of a vast field where a large part of the death camp had been situated. This impressively enormous space, now filled with burnt stones of varying sizes to suggest that nothing could ever live or grow here again, is in fact off limits to the visitor. The commemorative act consists of walking around it. The walk is tiring. This, as I have said, was in 2005. In 2008, on the advice of a friend who suggested that I return to what she called my intellectual roots, I began to entertain the idea of writing something about the Greek classics. Although at first I was still incapable of beginning a new book, the idea of writing on a purely literary subject, on something whose charm and inventiveness, whose fantastical characters and settings and intricate construction would beguile and distract my still bruised mind, appealed to me more and more as the months and then the years passed. Wherever else it might lead, I thought, this Greek, this literary subject would at least allow me to leave behind the anguishing stories that had haunted me for so long and in time immobilized me. The tales of political collapse and religious intolerance, of escapes both successful and failed, of displacement and refugees, Germans and Jews. Soon after my friend shared her thought with me, the long period of morbid inaction I'd been experiencing began to yield to one of reading and animated contemplation until toward the end of that first decade of the century, for reasons that I would end up describing in the book that I eventually wrote, it became clear to me what my subject would be. I decided to write a book about the Odyssey.
Well, that's great to have that set up to where you were when you came to writing this book and all the difficulties that are around it. I thought the image of those models in Tel Aviv is something that reminds me of something else. I wasn't going to ask you this, but it seems like maybe a good place to start into this book, specifically when you recreate another house in this book. It's a house that looks over the Bosphorus and it has an amazing story. Maybe you could build a little model of that for us.
So yeah, so already from that excerpt, I hope it's, possible to see the way in which I'm trying to swirl different things together. And the model is, and I do this in a way that there are certain elements of the various stories I'm going to tell and literature I'm going to describe, which run through the book like sort of leitmotifs. And the model is one of the most important of those, because this sort of childish fascination with building replicas becomes a kind of metaphor for what writers try to do, right? We're all making models. We're all trying to reconstitute something that's gone into something that exists, right? The model itself is an important theme in one of the books that I talk about, which is W.G. Sebald's The Rings of Saturn. But as you say, the sort of climax of the book, in a funny way, which I'm certainly not going to give away now, turns on the identification of a house. And it is a house in Istanbul. This is funny because this looks like a book that celebrates certain elements of Western culture, but the hidden joke of the book is that the figure who brings everything together and creates the kind of biggest ring of all that incorporates all three of the writers that I talk about is in fact a Turk. And there is a house that overlooks the Bosphorus, which is an important element in the story of the first of the writers that I write about in the first ring, so to speak, which is the great German Jewish scholar Erich Auerbach, who in fact was a refugee from Hitler in the 1930s, a great expert on medieval literature, who had to flee from Europe and ended up in Istanbul. And Istanbul is another leitmotif of the book. It keeps cropping up in funny places. Well, of course, it's always in the same place, but it keeps cropping up. And so already, in the passage I just read, right, I say, I don't want to think about these terrible stories anymore. I'm going to write a book about Greek culture. But the sort of joke of the way that introduction ends is that just writing the history of literary criticism and Homeric scholarship gets you right back to the Holocaust, right? So here I am writing about Auerbach, whose book is called Mimesis, The Representation of Reality in Western Literature. And it's a book which takes 20 texts from Homer to Virginia Woolf and analyzes how writing makes things feel real, basically. How does a passage of writing makes something feel like it is a representation of a recognizable reality. So I ended up right back in the Holocaust as soon as I started with this book that I thought was going to be a relief from the Holocaust. And he ends up a refugee in Turkey. And without giving away, because it is sort of the final ring is completed in Istanbul in my book, you know, it turns out all these stories are connected, right? The second of my rings is this 17th century French writer, François Fénelon, who is also inspired by the Odyssey, as was Auerbach. Auerbach, the first chapter of Auerbach's book about Western literature is about the Odyssey and how it tells its stories. Then Fénelon in the 1699 publishes a sort of fan fiction based on the Odyssey, which is really what it is. It takes character, it's called The Adventures of Telemachus. It takes characters from the Odyssey and invents new adventures for them. And then the third ring is a German writer who's sort of haunted by the Holocaust, the great late German novelist Sebald, W.G. Sebald, whose books I became obsessed with because they are characterized by this sort of Odyssean wandering narrative. You know, it's always about these people who are taking walks and getting lost, and they're haunted by some oppressive, depressive melancholy. And one feels, and I think one of the great achievements of his work is that he's a German, not a Jew, who was born at the very end of the war. He has no culpability or complicity. And yet he's haunted by this same event. And one feels it in his books, although with a few big exceptions, it's never mentioned, but you always feel it in the background. So it turns out all these stories are connected by a kind of Odyssean wandering characters, wandering narratives that look like they're digressing, but turn out not to be digressions. In a funny way, they're all three of these guys were exiled. So they're the victims of oppressive politics. And the more I wrote about them, the more I realized there were these threads tying them together, and it all ends up in this house in Istanbul. That's all I'm going to say about that. But the idea of the model, right, is very important in the book. And it's introduced in this sort of casual way in the passage I just read, because the whole idea of writing, of representing, is essentially model making.
One of the things that you write about, and that I think not only in this book, I think it kind of becomes crystallized in this book in a way that is very recognizable to me as someone who's been reading you forever. I actually started reading you when you wrote that piece about Greek homosexuality. And what was that in? It was in some scholarly journal. What was the guy's name?
Oh, it was a long review, I know what you're talking about, of that book which tried to argue that the Catholic Church was performing gay marriages in the Middle Ages.
Yeah, it was a totally fake book, but you picked it apart in this hilarious way, and in a way that only somebody with that kind of experience of actually reading a text could do. And I think that in this, you know, when you're talking about these different ways of writing, a lot of the things are familiar to me. You know, the things you've mentioned, from the Holocaust to the Greeks. These are things that have come up time and time again in your writing, but you come at it from a really different way. And when I think about this, and it is, you know, in the Latin sense of the word, it's a fiction, this book. You know, it's something that's put together, but we have this kind of, you remember this, I don't know if our viewers remember this, but remember when you could smoke in restaurants? And and you would walk in and they would say smoking or non.
Right.
And there's this kind of thing about that in publishing too, where it's fiction or non.
Yeah,
and,
I know. Don't get me started.
Well, I know, me too. But maybe I should get you started.
Well, yeah. So I appreciate the thought, right? That this book is, you know, people have often asked me, and so I do two kinds of writing, basically. I write a lot of criticism, obviously, and then I write these, whatever you want to call it, narrative nonfiction, memoir, I don't know, you know, how to call it exactly. I'm trying to invent a new genre, I think, which mixes, you know, personal narratives and sort of extended reflections on ancient texts. And what I'm interested in, what I've always been interested, and what this new book allows me to do sort of more explicitly than I've ever done before, is just talk about what I just said I don't want to get started on, which is that what is interesting and satisfying to people. Well, let me back up 2 steps. I still think in this country, but really all over, there's the highest and most literary form of writing is still considered to be the novel, right? That's the imaginative, people always talk about imaginative literature and then everything else as if it required no imagination to write.
Which is a much more recent idea than people realize, I think.
Yes, right. And so I'm interested in sort of breaking the back of that division between fiction and nonfiction, not with respect to truth value, because now more than ever, we need to be able to make critical distinctions between what is fictive and what is in fact true. But in the sense that what people want, I think quite often when we talk about imaginative literature and the satisfactions of a novel, what I think is going on is people want a good story. If the story is true, that's just as good. If it's made up in someone's head, that's also good. But what people want is a satisfying narrative, a beginning, a middle, and an end, as Aristotle would say, right? Something that has a shape and that delivers some kind of meaning. And that's what I'm interested in. So people, I was going to say, in some interviews, when I have a book come out and people say, but, you wrote this, grandiose Holocaust family narrative, and then you wrote this thing about your father, and when are you going to write a novel? And I always say, to hell with you. I feel like I've already written my novels because I could never write a novel because I could never make up a story. I can't even do like the chicken crosses the road. I wouldn't even know what happened next. And I don't need to make stuff up because as this new book, I hope, shows more than any of my other books, life gives you such improbable narratives, the amazing coincidence. This new book is all about chance and coincidence, and I keep working that theme by tying together these stories, which really are connected in improbable and amazing ways. And so I really want to resist the idea that everything that is not the novel is in one category. It's so preposterous, because what I really am interested in, as I say, what I think people like is I just think there are narrative books, which can be either invented or true, but they deliver a satisfying narrative, and that's what people want. I remember when I was a book critic at New York Magazine, and there was that book that came across my desk as a possible, book to review, and it was Seabiscuit. And I remember thinking to myself, there is no way I'm going to read 400 pages about a horse, having grown up on Mr. Ed, and the fact is, it was an amazingly wonderful book because it's a great story. And not only is it a great story, because that's what I would say life gives you, right? That's what happened.
Right.
But she makes it into a great story. She crafts it so that it is gripping from chapter to chapter, and it has a shape and an arc. And so in this book, more than in my other books, where I worry about narrative in different ways, like in the Holocaust book, obviously it's a famous problem, right? How do you narrate this unimaginable event, right? That's the famous Holocaust problem. But in this book, it's front and center because every story I tell, there are these 3 sort of mini bios of these writers through which I thread the story of my own writer's block. But that's what I'm really interested in is what makes a good story? Why do certain stories feel real, which is Auerbach's worry? How do you invent a new story in this world where every story has been told? That was Fénelon's problem. He's writing a fan fiction based on the Odyssey. Good luck with that, right? And can stories ultimately, what if you try to tell a story that cannot be told, which I think is Auerbach's anxiety. What if the weight of events is so great that it crushes the shape of a story until all you have is just getting lost?
Well, but what Auerbach did is a lot similar to what you're doing, which is going into the language and taking it apart in a way that reveals something different.
Right. And so what I'm hoping to do here, I'm also trying to find a way, you're looking at a person who fled academia at one point, because I was in grad school at a moment of particular nuttiness in the theory wars. But I want to be able to write about text, about thinking about text, about describing how texts work in a way that's not academic, that's sort of itself novelistic. And one of the things I describe at the beginning of this book is the way Auerbach, so the joke of the book is I was having terrible trouble writing my Odyssey book, An Odyssey, a father, a son, and an epic. And I remembered or somebody pointed me in the direction and said, oh, you should look at Auerbach again, because he talks about this great thing called ring composition at the beginning of Mimesis, his great ode to Western literature. And I misremembered what he had to say, because it turns out he doesn't like ring composition at all, which is the style that I use quite often. And so one of the things that I talk about at the beginning of my book is how he basically divides narrative into two possibilities. This Greek way of telling a story in which you keep circling back and giving more and more backstories so that you can know everything potentially about a given tale. And then the Hebrew, the style of the Hebrew Bible, which he talks about, which is more opaque, it leaves things out, it makes you wonder, it doesn't give you everything. And for me, as you know, at the beginning of this book, I make those into sort of metaphors of what I call optimistic narrative and pessimistic narrative. Can a story tell you everything? And the corollary, given our interest in good storytelling, is if you told everything, would it be a good story?
Well, I think that's something that you learn very early on as a writer of whatever you're writing, is that actually details can easily bore people. You can easily get into telling somebody what they ate for lunch. And this is a lot of what, I've written biographies, and a lot of what bores people in biographies and makes people not want to read them is, at 11:30, I went downstairs and got the mail or something. And people do this quite a lot. And I think that kind of basic thing, do you think that do you think that nonfiction and this kind of attention to very small details that Auerbach describes throughout his book, and also actually that Sebald also describes, Sebald is really good at a turd on the country road, building this whole edifice on top of it. Is that something that you're aware of?
Well, I think, but again, detail is the famous problem, right? You have to, as you know better than I probably, I can't imagine in a funny way anything more difficult than writing a biography, because a life has what feels like an infinite amount of detail, although I guess necessarily it has to be finite because they died. But you know what I mean? And the question is, what to keep in, what to leave out. And I always used to, when I do this thing at Bard where I talk to seniors about how to write theses. And I always tell this anecdote, which is true. I was in the Metropolitan Museum of Art bookshop, and there's this period, I'm very interested in the 18th century in France, just as a kind of hobby. And there were these two biographies side by side of Madame de Pompadour, the mistress of Louis XV. So I pick up one which had just been published. It's like 1,000 pages long, and it's the life of Madame de Pompadour. And it starts out, whatever her real name was, Jeanne Poisson, was born on December 25th, 1728, into a blah, blah, blah family. She was baptized on this day, whatever. The book next to that one was this big. It was this slim volume by Nancy Mitford, the British novelist.
Great book.
He had written a biography of Madame de Pompadour, and here's her opening line. It's like something like, the old king was dead and a fresh breeze was blowing through the halls of Versailles. And I'm like, which book do you want to read? So it's this eternal problem of like what to keep in. It's about shape. And sometimes, look, details are important. And certainly in Sebald, there are these flickers of detail, objects, photographs, that flicker through the narrative and they glint and you think, is that important? But then it comes back, and I certainly wanted to give my new book that flavor. Like there are these sort of elements, wolves, dogs, works of art, buildings that keep cycling, trees, that keep cycling around. But that's the hard part. And again, the good narrator, whether fiction, nonfiction, biography, knows what to put in and what to leave out.
It's very physical, don't you think?
Yeah.
I've always noticed that often if I have some great story that I love, and maybe I flew to like Bangkok to interview this dying woman who told me this in her final breath, and I really want to include it, and I'll put it in there. And for some reason, when I'm rereading, it physically, it's like a taste that's not right. Yeah. And it's kind of hard to explain why. I mean, do you have any ideas about why certain details match and some don't?
Well, look, because this is, writing 101. This is not what I'm going to say is very sophisticated, but it's incredibly true. A certain kind of detail will bring an event to life in the imagination of a reader in a way that no amount of description could. So here's an example from my writing of The Lost, my family Holocaust book. So I went with my siblings on my first research trip. We went to our ancestral shtetl in Ukraine, led by Alex Dunai. And a woman was telling, and so we went, it's a tiny little town, and Alex said, basically just stand outside the church and grab old people and ask them if they knew your relatives. That was our research method. And an old woman told a story about how, as a teenage girl during the war, she saw a roundup of Jews. She was Ukrainian. And she said she lived in a house on the road that led to the cemetery where these mass shootings took place. And she said the sound of the shooting went on for so long that her mother took down her sewing machine, which was an old-fashioned sewing machine that you run with a pedal.
Feet, yeah.
Creaky pedal, and she just ran the sewing machine to cover up the noise of the Jews of the town being machine gunned. That is a detail that has stuck in my mind for 21 years, So, it's funny you said there's something physical, and I always think of sculpture. You sort of hack away everything that doesn't mean something. And, I'm begging a lot of questions here, because what means something? Something like that. The minute I heard it, I thought, I have to put this in the book, because it brought into an incredible physical reality what it was like to be in that town on that day. Not what it was like to be one of the first.
Have you ever had something like that, though, that's that good and you can't use?
Yes, I had. In fact, in that book, there were stories people told me that they told me I couldn't use in the book.
Right.
And in the book I would write, she then told me a story which I cannot repeat. Because I think, not as a tease, but to make people aware that even, look, you wrote a big biography of Sontag. I wrote a big biography of, a family biography of the Holocaust. But the illusion that you're getting the whole story is one I'm constantly interested in disrupting, because I'm interested.
Something that actually Sontag writes a lot about where you put the frame in the photograph.
How you frame things. Because I want to always remind my reader that even in nonfiction, you're shaping, you're leaving things out, you're ficting, right? As you mentioned the Latin root, right? You're creating something, and that it's not true, but it cannot be the whole truth, because that's a book no one wants to read. You have
also similarly, there's also novels that are that can be true, and there also can be dishonest novels, which is kind of funny, because you think there's this artificial thing happening so everybody knows it's fake, but it's not fake. You know, there's a different kind of truth. But I just want to, before we go to some questions, because we're kind of not great with time, actually. We just have a few more minutes. I just wanted to ask you one thing about.
Well, I think we're going to 6, no? Sorry, 7. We have 15 minutes. I think we're good.
Oh yeah, but we have some questions. So I just wanted to let people ask questions. If anyone,
right.
Do people know how to ask questions?
Yeah, they're asking. I can see the questions.
They're asking. Okay, good. I just want to make sure everybody knows that, and we give some time for that. Did you talked something that I thought was really, I think you do something that everybody does, but you foregrounded it in a different way in this book, which is writing through something. You know, you have this kind of material and you start, and it becomes in your hands as you're writing something totally different. Can you talk about that a little bit in this book specifically?
Well, I'm very interested in this. I think I actually do this in most of my writing, even in my critical writing. I always think that the writing, this is totally personal. I'm not giving a seminar on how to write here, but for me, every piece of writing is really the story of you figuring out what the piece is about.
Right.
If that makes sense.
Yeah.
So like when I start a book review, one of those long pieces in the New York Review of Books or the Times Book Review, when I pick up the book, I have no preconceptions. I never review anything that I think I'm not going to like.
Right.
Because life is too short. And I think the review becomes the story of how you came to your opinion of the book. And I think the same thing is true of narrative nonfiction. Like, I don't know at the beginning where I'm going. In that sense, you know, everything for me is an essay, right? It's just, you start, you have a sort of massive material, and you start and you go. And
right.
I never know where I'm going to end. I know people who can write that way, but I am not one of them. You know, and this new book particularly, I literally just started writing on a train. I was on a book tour for my Odyssey book in Germany, and I spent 10 days on German trains, which are very nice trains to be on compared to Amtrak. And I just had a lot of time, and I just started writing. I'd been thinking a lot about all this stuff, Auerbach, Fénelon, blah, blah, blah. And that to me is the excitement of writing. If you knew what it was going to be about at the beginning, why write it in a funny way? You know?
Right. Well, but just one more observation about that. Fénelon's fan fiction, as you say, you know, it really is just another telling of an old story. But that's basically the idea of the historical novel. I mean, can you imagine, I'm not trying to usher you into fiction, but could you imagine trying to retell an ancient tale in that sort of novelistic form? Or does that not interest you?
No, it doesn't interest me, although I'm a great appreciator of it. Look at Mary Renault's, you know, The King Must Die, which is a fabulous retelling of the Theseus myth. You know, it can be done. Madeline Miller's Circe book. I mean, people are doing this all the time.
Kind of all historical fiction, right? I mean,
yeah, I love historical fiction.
Yeah.
You know, life keeps handing me amazing stories. I just don't see the need to make up anything.
Well, you know, I felt that way with Sontag. I thought, if I wrote this woman's life as a novel, it would be so preposterous and extravagant that nobody would ever believe it. And
so as you know, and then we'll go to these questions, but so in Three Rings, there are the most amazing coincidences, you know.
I was trying to get you to talk about the house, but you don't want to.
No, I'm not going to talk about the house, but
you should read, everybody should read that story because it's an incredible, crazy coincidence.
But, you know, but that's just, life made that happen. I didn't make it happen. You know, also with Fénelon, that section ends with an amazing coincidence. And I just am very interested in the way that, you know, amazing things do happen. And when you narrate them as a nonfiction writer, you have to convey the amazingness, which means you have to do a lot of work to structure things so the reader lands in a certain way, the way you want them to land. All right, let's go to questions because I see they're quite interesting.
Okay, can you read them? Do you want me to read them? here's the first one says, could you talk about the elements of writing in your new book? Well, you've already talked about that a little bit. What is the purpose of this aspect? Is to teach something about writing, or is it about the styles of these three writers?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I think I'm not sure I'm teaching about writing. I'm sort of pondering the way that those three writers wrote or thought about writing. You know, Auerbach is worried about the all-explanatory method of the Greeks versus the opaque method of the Hebrew. Fénelon is worried about how do you create a narrative that fits inside of a pre-existing narrative. Sebald is worried about everything, you know. And I feel that by entering into the lives and the thinking as best I can, they're smarter than I am, you know, that it helps the interested reader to think about just what writing is trying to do, you know, in a funny way, while being introduced to the amazing life stories of these characters, of these writers. And, you know, as you know, there's other writers who float through the book, Racine, Proust, this one, that one. You know, I'm just interested in looking at how other writers have tackled problems of composition and narration. But I want to do it in a way that I feel it's necessary to keep pointing out, this is not like a scholarly book of literary analysis, because I'm doing that thinking by telling the amazing stories of these guys' lives and winding my own little autobiographical elements through it.
So here's someone asked, how does your work relate to Alice Oswald's?
Oh, well, she's much better.
Okay.
No, Alice Oswald is this marvelous poet who sort of has looked at Homer, looked at the Iliad, and come up with a way of adapting. I'm very interested in the idea of adaptation, and although I am a guy who studied the classics, and I do think there's a way to study the classics and a sense of what the classics have to teach us, and God knows they were not perfect, the Greeks and the Romans. I am very open to the idea of adaptation, as were the Greeks and Romans. You know, that's all they did is adapt themselves. And so I love what Oswald did in her book, which sort of riffs these many deaths in the Iliad and creates a poem basically out of these little moments of commemoration in the Iliad. So I'm always excited. You know, Anne Carson obviously is another poet who has looked at the classics and made something new out of it. And I think Fénelon was sort of trying to do the same thing. So I'm all for that. I don't think classicists should be territorial. I think if somebody wants to play in the sandbox of classics, great.
Here's a question that I hope you understand better than I do.
I do, and it's from a very distinguished classicist whom I know.
Okay, do you want to just take it and run?
So this is from Judith Hallett, a classicist I know and admire, who's asking about Auerbach. And in a chapter that he has about Roman literature, he's interested in lower class speech. One of the achievements of, some people have heard of Petronius's Satyricon, this sort of wacky novel. And Judith is interested in Auerbach's interest in how the author of that novel uses lower class speech in a realistic way. So people don't speak in the sort of high way that they do in the Iliad and the Odyssey or in the Aeneid. And that there is this idea that
How common is that in classical literature?
Well, it gets more common, but it's, you know, there are attempts to do it as early as Homer and as early as Sophocles' Antigone has a famous example of this poor schmuck who's a guard, who speaks in a very naturalistic way. And Judith is mentioning this idea that in the Satyricon, this character, the wealthy nouveau riche who's giving the banquet, is actually a Jewish guy. And I think that's typical of Auerbach, that he would focus on that. I'm not a great Auerbach scholar, I want to make that clear, but the way that he sidles up to Jewish question. You know, here is this guy who's Jewish, who's been expelled from his university, loses his chair in literature, flees to Istanbul. And at the beginning of Three Rings, I'm always interested by the way that at a certain point in his discussion of the Hebrew Bible, he refers to the Jews as if they were different from him, that he talks about the Jews, you know, not us. So at some point, Judith, I would love to talk to you more about this, because I think it was interesting that that's what he focuses on as an example of realism in a certain kind of Roman literature.
Great. This next question is a question I think any writer deals with. Basically, write a book that you already wrote in a different way. And speaking of the Odyssey, as your experience grows, as time passes, your perspective changes. Do you ever look at it and think something was wrong, or something should have been longer, or something should have been shorter?
I think, you know, it was funny, I was just reading a review of Three Rings in a French newspaper. It came out simultaneously in French. And the reviewer makes this swipe at an Odyssey. She said it was a little too long. And I was like, wow, you know. But it's an interesting question, because something I think it's important for readers to understand is that the writer who writes X book is not necessarily the writer who writes a book 2 years later.
Right.
You know, people keep forgetting that you're a moving target. You know, so Ben and I were talking at the beginning of this discussion about how we met when I was putting out the manuscript of my first book, which was published in 1999, and I wrote it from 1994 to 1998. And I would never write that book that way now. Like, the me who wrote that book is a lost person, vanished person. So, and that's one of the interesting things of being a writer, I think, is that you're a moving target, your tastes change. I think that Three Rings is by far my best book. I think it's the most controlled. I think it's the most technically accomplished. The way I wield the material and handle it, I think, is better than I've ever done before. I think my insights are different at the age of 60 than they were at 35. I certainly hope so. So I love this question, because I think you're always changing. If I were to write an Odyssey now, of course it would be different. But you know, your books are also like your children. I always say your books are like your children. You know exactly how good and bad they are. But that doesn't mean you want to hear about it from anybody else. But yeah, I think it's interesting.
True. I don't know that that's always true. Do you think you know how good and bad your books are?
I think I do. You know, you only mind criticism that you think is wrong, but criticism, I feel like when I read reviews of my own book and I think they're right, you're always grateful, even if it hurts a little bit. You can always learn a lot from a valid criticism. Yeah.
Okay, so finally we have one more, and then we're going to do our thing. I think we're supposed to talk about what we're reading, right? Someone asks, Elizabeth Murowski asks, did you have a mentor?
I've been lucky because I've had great mentors my whole life, really. I was a child who loved teachers. I mean, as a writer, I've had a number of great editors. I would put Bob Silvers, the late founding editor of the New York Review, at probably the top of that list. Bob Gottlieb, who's a personal friend, was never my actual editor, but has been an incredible, he was the editor of Knopf, the editor of the New Yorker. He has looked at everything I've ever written, and it's been better because of him. Chip McGrath, who used to be the editor of the New York Times Book Review when I wrote very often for the Times Book Review. I mean, Nancy Novigrad, my editor when I used to write travel articles, has an incredible eye. So I feel lucky to have fallen into the hands of people who, you know, in my early stage of my writing career, really helped me think about my
Is there
writing.
a mentor you didn't have? I'm thinking about that because I had a lot of great mentors. I was a kid that loved teachers too, but was there somebody that didn't appear on your path?
It's funny you asked that because I don't know about mentors, but when I first started writing in the early 90s, when I started publishing, and I got to New York in 1994 after I finished my PhD, and there were certain people who had just died, who people were always telling me, oh, I wish you had, like James Merrill.
Yes.
So many people used to say to me, oh, you would have loved Jimmy, and I always think of people like that, Lincoln.
He's the face on Daniel's shelf behind you, by the way, if anyone's wondering who that is.
Oh, okay. So yeah, but I do feel lucky. I think real writers are always grateful for editing. The only people I know who complain about editors are people who are not really writers.
Right.
I don't know what I would do without those people.
Same here. Here's Beth.
Hello, and Ben, you're right. I am here to ask you what you two are reading right now. I don't mean to cut you off, but we've gotten to that time.
Daniel?
I'm going back, I'm actually reading this wonderful German novelist called Jenny Erpenbeck, whom I'm doing a big essay about actually right now. And so I'm immersed in fabulous young, I think she's only in her mid-50s, young-ish for me, German novelist. So I'm immersed in her work and loving every minute of it. She has an incredible book called The End of Days, which I highly recommend, an amazing story with a brilliant narrative trick. So that's what I'm immersed in right now.
And I am immersed in my old icon from when I met you, Daniel. About that time, there were two writers that were really the most important to me. Clarice Lispector, who I later devoted, and still to this day, devoted about 20 years of my life to. And the other was V.S. Naipaul. And I've gone back to him, and I'm reading The Mimic Men, which is his novel of the end of the 60s. And he's somebody that absolutely intimidated me. I mean, he was a mentor to me. He was very kind to me. He has this horrible, ferocious reputation.
Yes.
But to me and to a lot of other people, he was actually very, very nice and extremely respectful. Nobody needed to be respectful of me. I was like 22 or whatever when I met him. But I was so intimidated by his work that I think I had to be in my 40s before I could really go back to it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both so much. This conversation was gorgeous, just as Three Rings is a really, really gorgeous book. And I thank you both for spending your evening with P&P, and I thank the audience for doing the same. I'll remind everybody that the book link to Three Rings is in the chat, and you'll get an email with it later, as well as with these fabulous recommendations from our speakers tonight. So thank you, once more. Everybody stay well and stay well read.
Thanks so much.
Everybody. Thank you.
Bye, guys. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.